Good morning and welcome to Vessel Traffic in Canada's Pacific region. I'm Edward Downing, Clear Seas' Communications Director, and I'll be the moderator today for this morning's session. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on the shared territories of the Coquitlam, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples who are stewards of the lands and waters in the past and present and future. I am grateful to be here, and territory acknowledgements are a good way to situate ourselves locally. Next slide, please. Today's panelists are Jen Steele, our Manager of Research and Knowledge Mobilization, Paul Blumeris, our Executive Director, and Jim Hodgson, our Research Associate. Our agenda will be, after these welcoming comments, provide a project context and overview, some of our key findings, and we'll have lots of time for a Q&A, so please submit your questions through the app on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, I'd just like to give a quick recap on Clear Seas. We're here to facilitate a better understanding of the risks, benefits, and best practices for safe and sustainable marine shipping in Canada. We support evidence-based public policy, and we bring clarity to decision-making processes. We are truly an online reference. All of our information is accessible to the public on our webpage, and we've had over 440,000 page views, 230,000 users, which is the size of a small city, and we're pleased that we have 56,000 Francophone users too. And with that, I'd like to now welcome Jen, our Manager of Research. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Edward, for the introduction. And again, a warm welcome to all of those who have joined us today or who are listening in after the fact to the webinar recording. So as Edward said, I'll start by providing some background context on the Vessel Traffic Analysis Project, including how it relates to our other research initiatives here at Clear Seas. I'll also give a brief overview of the project scope and the methods that were used in the analysis before passing it over to Paul for a showcase on some of the key highlights from our research. So why did we undertake this work and why is it important? We know that maritime shipping is an important part of our local and global economy. The commercial shipping activities happening on the Pacific coast serve as both a gateway to international trade and to supply BC's coastal communities. This vessel traffic has a direct effect on coastal communities and First Nations who live along the coast and in port communities. We also know from our work here at Clear Seas that the world of commercial shipping can still be a relative mystery for many Canadians, even for those people living in close proximity to shipping lanes, anchorage locations, ports, and terminals. This is made more challenging by the lack of clear and comprehensive information about how many ships there are, where they go, and how much oil they carry. So to help address the gaps and concerns, our vessel traffic analysis approached that question for the Pacific region as a whole. We sought out to provide a comprehensive picture of marine trade and traffic in the region, including an analysis on the travel patterns of commercial ships, as well as the amount of oil they carry, looking at both oil carried as fuel and oil carried as cargo. So this project is one component in Clear Seas Marine Transportation Corridors Initiative for the Pacific region. The other works under this initiative have included a vessel drift and response analysis, which assessed drift rates versus the location and availability of emergency tow vessels to find zones of no save, an emergency towing vessel needs assessment to better understand the capabilities needed for ETVs, a tugs of opportunity study, which examined the availability and capabilities of non-rescue tugs should an ETV not be available, and our sensitive coastal areas assessment, which we released last fall as a report and an interactive web mapping application, which looked at the vulnerability of coastal areas to oil spills. So together, this collective body of work is intended to help support and inform risk management and marine spatial planning in the Pacific region. So the study area includes most of the marine waters in the Pacific region, including the inside passage and offshore waters to the outer boundary of Canada's exclusive economic zone, 200 nautical miles offshore. The analysis used passage lines, so 9 passage lines were defined at key locations along the coast and at the entrances to main ports. These lines act as tripwires that count and record each vessel that crosses the line during the study period. The study also considered the ports at which commercial shipping vessels typically call. So the study used 3 years of automatic identification system data, AIS data, transmitted from commercial vessels in the study area. The AIS data is received as points and includes a ship's location, the unique ship identifier, and other characteristics, which are broadcasted several times each minute. A computer algorithm was used to connect the set of AIS position signals for each vessel together into a track line, as demonstrated on the right there, that illustrates the path taken by each ship on its journey. Each track line was then matched up to the information for the corresponding vessel size, cargo capacity, fuel capacity, age, and flag state, all into a spatial dataset. This dataset was used to create vessel traffic maps and to complete the traffic pattern and oil carriage analysis in the study. The work was done by Nuka Research and Planning Group, who are based out of Alaska, with additional analyses, interpretation, and visualization of the data by our analysts here at Clairseas. So the figure to the left here shows the results of this process. It's an illustration of the vessel tracks generated from the AIS data. The 4 different colors shown here represent the different categories of vessel types that were used in the study. The 4 ship type categories include cargo ships, tankers, tugs, and cruise ships, with different ship subtypes as illustrated in the figure to the right, the image to the right there. So because our focus was on commercial shipping vessels, meaning vessels that transport goods and materials for commercial or trade purposes, the study does not consider other types of vessels operating in the region, such as fishing vessels, ferries, or pleasure craft. So this selection was to focus on the type of ships that represent the largest potential risk for oil spills because of the volume and type of oil that they carry. So while cruise ships don't meet our definition of commercial shipping vessels, they often carry heavy fuel oil as fuel, so it's important to include them in this analysis. They're also a very recognizable ship type on the Pacific coast and an easy point of reference for the general public. So taken together from these tracks, the passage line count and crossing counts, and the corresponding vessel attributes, including the oil air information, we were able to do some interesting and illuminating analyses by the type of vessel and the type of oil carried along the different shipping routes and calling on the different ports around BC's coast. So on that note, I will pass it over to Paul to give us a tour through some of these key highlights. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. I'm going to take you through some of the key findings from the report that the research team were able to discern. There are obviously many more details than we have time to go through in this webinar, so I'd encourage you after the webinar to take a look at the report and go through those details yourself. But let's look at some of the highlights and key findings from the report. So a useful starting point is to try to position the vessel traffic that calls on Canada's Pacific coast in a global context. And one way to do that is to look at the global trade routes that connect the ports along the Pacific coast of North America with ports around the world. So importantly, the trade with Asia and other ports across the Pacific, you can see they're represented in the sort of blue lines. And then also trade up and down the west coast of North America. So Anchorage, Alaska in the north, and then down to the south along the west coast of California and to the Panama Canal and South America in the south. And these are the important trade routes that bring ships to Canada's Pacific region. But when looking at that map, you might ask yourself one question, which is for those ships heading, for instance, from Vancouver to ports across the Pacific, why do they head towards Alaska and this gap in the Aleutian Islands here? Why not head direct due west across the Pacific Ocean to those ports? Now, the answer is in the Great Circle phenomenon. You may have come across this when you travel in an aircraft. If you take a flight from Canada to a destination in Europe or Asia, you might take a polar route. That's an example of another Great Circle route. And ships do exactly the same thing. It's helpful to visualize. If you take a look at this representation from Google Earth, and you look at the shortest distance between, say, Vancouver and Japan, it's obviously a straight line, and plotted on a globe, you can see it passes right through that gap in the Aleutian Islands that we saw ships traveling on the previous slide. And it's only when we put it on a rectangular map projection like the one you're seeing today that it takes on these circular formats. And our ships are taking that route to take the shortest distance to minimize the time, but also importantly to minimize the amount of fuel and to minimize the costs incurred in transporting the goods across the ocean. But it's not just geography that influences the ship traffic patterns. As part of the study, the team looked at how other forms of protections, particularly environmental protections, and how they impacted the traffic patterns of ships. One really important environmental protection in North America is the Sulfur Emissions Control Area, the SECA. Now, this was put in place in order to control emissions of sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide is an air pollutant. It's caused when ships burn fuel that contains sulfur, and it causes smog, and it can be harmful to human health. So this environmental protection was put in place in North America in 2012, and it required ships in this blue region on the map here to burn low sulfur fuel. In 2012, it was initially set at 1% sulfur compared to, say, the 2 to 3% sulfur that is normally found or was normally found in heavy fuel oil. And then in 2015, that was reduced to 0.1% sulfur. Now, one consequence of that is that low sulfur fuel is more expensive than the fuel that ship operators were used to burning. And during the study period, we observed that this caused a change in shipping traffic behavior. So instead of taking this shortest distance route, which spends a long time in the blue seeker and burning expensive low sulfur fuel, ship traffic patterns began to change, and we began to see these kinds of patterns taking a shorter distance through the seeker and then heading onto a Great Circle route, and even a more extreme southerly route, so taking the shortest possible distance through the seeker and traveling then on the Great Circle. And this is all in an attempt to minimize the total cost of the voyage, so minimize the amount of expensive fuel to be burned, even though it takes it on a longer distance. And you can see also ships heading south towards the Panama Canal doing the same thing. Instead of heading directly down the coast, the west coast of the United States, heading out to sea the 200 nautical miles that makes up this seeker, and heading south. And this can be quite significant detours. So this route here, that is just over 60 kilometers longer than the shortest distance. And this route here is over 200 kilometers longer. So one consequence is it moves ship traffic further offshore. But another consequence is that ships actually burn more fuel because they're traveling a further distance. So although the total fuel cost is lower, the amount of fuel burnt is larger. And that has a consequence on greenhouse gas emissions. So the team did some analysis for this study, just looking at this route, the additional 60 kilometers that it needs to travel and the ships that travel on it, and found that in an average year, that's adding 24 kilotons of carbon dioxide emissions to our greenhouse gas emissions. And to give you a feeling for what that is, that's around the emissions of about 5,000 gasoline-powered passenger cars in 1 year. So quite a significant additional incremental emissions as a consequence, greenhouse gas emissions as a consequence of this sulfur emissions control. Now, sulfur emissions are not the only environmental protections in the region. Another important one is the tanker exclusion zone. You can see that on the map here, this dotted line is the tanker exclusion zone, and that's been in place since 1985. And the intention here is to require tankers coming from the oil fields in Alaska, bringing crude oil down to the refineries in Washington State, to remain outside of this black dotted line and keep a distance offshore. So you might think that tankers would take the most direct route, skirting as close as possible to the edge of that zone before turning into the Straits of Juan de Fuca and heading to their destinations. But that's not what they do. The path that they actually take is this one. Again, motivated by an attempt to try to spend some time outside of the sulfur emissions control area to minimize the total fuel cost on the journey. And then as they come in closer to the Straits of Juan de Fuca, they are staying outside of the tanker exclusion zone. So a consequence of that is that the distance, for instance, off the coast of Haida Gwaii that these tankers are traveling is driven not necessarily by the tanker exclusion zone, but is actually caused by their desire to minimize the total voyage cost by avoiding burning low sulfur fuel in this portion of the voyage. So one interesting phenomenon is that now, as of 2020, with the introduction of the so-called IMO, International Maritime Organization 2020 regulations, the sulfur content of the fuel in open ocean has been reduced to 0.5%, increasing the cost of that fuel, and so reducing the differential between the costs of the fuels in the blue zone and the white zone. And we're constantly monitoring to see whether that will change any of the traffic patterns. As of today, we can still see that ships follow the routes that you can see on the map. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that ships always travel these carefully optimized route patterns. Although most ships travel these route patterns, the study also found that weather can have an important impact on ship direction. And storms and heavy weather will cause ships to take evasive action to try to find regions of more sheltered waters. And this continues. Just the other day, in January, there was a large storm in the North Pacific that caused ships to alter their course. And here's one example for you. This is an extract from marinetraffic.com showing you a container ship leaving from Vancouver's Roberts Bank terminal, heading for Korea. And instead of heading out onto one of those great circle routes we talked about into this open Pacific Ocean, it turns north and heads east of Haida Gwaii to stay sheltered from the storm. And for good reason. We've seen recently many incidences of container ships getting into trouble and losing cargo and losing containers overboard in heavy weather. So let's dig into that ship traffic, international ship traffic in a bit more detail. For the report, we created these flow diagrams to help to visualize that ship traffic. So around 4,000 ships travel those international trade routes that we've just described, arriving in Canada's Pacific waters. And they come for the purposes of calling on the major ports that you see represented there for the purposes of loading or unloading of cargo. And the way to read these flow diagrams, you can see the width of the line represents the number of ships in an average year traveling those courses. So for instance, just over 3,600 ships pass through the Straits of Juan de Fuca on the way to calling on the ports in Vancouver or the ports in Washington State, Seattle and Tacoma. So Vancouver is the largest port complex in the region with over 2,600 port calls in an average year. Now, we can break that down further by individual ship type. So now you can see the same flow diagrams, but by different ship types. So let's take the most common ship type in the region, first of all, bulk carriers. These are ships that carry dry cargo in closed holds. Very common in the region. Examples of the kind of cargo they'll carry would be coal or grain, like agricultural products. And you can see that most of the 1,700 or 1,800 odd bulk carriers that call on the region are coming to Vancouver, around 1,200 or 1,300 of them. Next is container ships. You probably recognize them by the containers stacked up on the deck. And over 1,000 container ships call on the region to Prince Rupert, Vancouver, and the ports in Seattle and Tacoma. But interestingly, you can see there a phenomenon for container ships that around just over 300 of them are actually calling on multiple ports in the same voyage. So that demonstrates how the ports along the west coast of North America are part of an interconnected transportation network with ships calling on multiple ports in the same voyage. Next up are vehicle carriers. These are high-sided voyages, vessels, quite characteristically looking. I would keep an eye out for them. They bring cars, mostly from Japan and Korea, and their cargo can actually drive on and off. So they're so-called roll-on, roll-off cargo vessels. And you can see again some of the traffic going to Canadian ports in Vancouver, some to Washington, the United States, and some ships going to both. More recently, there's a vehicle terminal been established in Nanaimo, so some of that traffic will also be headed to Nanaimo. Finally, tankers. These are a little bit harder to spot. You can recognize them sometimes by the piping and machinery on their upper deck, and they carry liquid cargo, like oil and chemical products, and you can see the traffic patterns there, calling on mostly in Vancouver and the ports in Washington State in the United States. But let's dig into the tanker traffic in a bit more detail. So on this map, you will see the tanker traffic in the Salish Sea, but in combination with all the other vessel traffic that you see. So here on this map, here you can see Vancouver Island, the Straits of Juan de Fuca. Vancouver is up here on the top right-hand side, and we've added in not only the cargo ships in purple, like the bulk carriers, the container ships, but also tugs in yellow, cruise ships in green, and then the tankers in blue. And on the right are just the tankers, so you can understand where tankers are traveling. So tankers will enter the Straits of Juan de Fuca using the traffic separation scheme to maintain a safe distance between inbound and outbound traffic. And then those headed for Burrard Inlet for either the Parkland refinery or the Westridge oil terminals here will navigate northwards. And then those heading for the oil refineries in Washington State here in Anacortes or Cherry Point will take these paths that you see here. So for the study, we wanted to understand, how much oil do all these ships bring, both as a cargo in the case of tankers, but also as a ship fuel, because of course all of these international open ocean voyaging ships are carrying heavy fuel oil as an oil in their fuel tanks. And these are all forms of what we call persistent oil. So we wanted to understand there's two kinds of oil, broadly speaking, persistent oil and non-persistent oil. Persistent oil, our examples would be the crude oil or heavy fuel oil. And it is the densest, it's the stickiest, longest lasting kind of oil in the environment, and it floats on water and can be particularly damaging in the case of a spill. So it's important to monitor the amount of persistent oil in the region. So we wanted to understand that. So using our knowledge of the ships that are calling on the region and the knowledge of how much oil they're carrying both as a cargo and a fuel, we can understand how much oil is in the region. So this is the results of the analysis for the Salish Sea, and we've turned these the quantities of oil into tanker equivalent units, into the amount of oil carried on average by an Aframax size tanker, an average size tanker calling on Vancouver oil terminals. So you can see the largest quantity of oil in the region is brought to us by tankers calling on the US ports that we mentioned, the oil coming from Alaska to the refineries in Washington State. Interestingly, second largest component of oil in the region is brought as ship fuel, so heavy fuel oil in those thousands of ships calling on the region makes up a significant component of persistent oil in the region. And then third are the tankers calling on Canadian ports in Burrard Inlet, predominantly. Now, we wanted to understand what would be the impact of the Trans Mountain expansion project. And so taking the numbers used for that project analysis and adding them, you can see what the difference would be. So now the graph changes, and the light blue addition is what would be what is projected for the Trans Mountain expansion project, and that would increase the volume of oil in the region due to Canadian oil traffic to be similar in size to that brought to the region by the tankers bringing crude oil to the refineries in the US. So we can apply the same oil density approach. Oh, sorry, I've got one more slide on the Trans Mountain expansion project. The other thing we could do is look at how will that impact the number of tankers in the region. So these are the flow diagrams that we created earlier on, and now you can see how would that change with the addition of the tankers for the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. So this is the before picture, this is the after picture, and we've added this light purple line to show the approximately 300 tankers per year. So now, because the tankers calling on the Westridge terminal are smaller, there are more of them carrying a similar amount of crude oil, and tankers in Vancouver would now become slightly less common than container ships at around 550 tankers calling on the Vancouver region per year. But let's move on and look at persistent oil in other regions. What we can do is we can create these oil density maps. So what we've done here is to say we know where ships are moving in the region because of the traffic analysis. We also know how much oil they're carrying of different types. For the moment, we're going to focus on persistent oil because of its importance, as I mentioned, in terms of its risk as a pollutant. And so you can see now the oil density, there are regions of high oil density are regions where ships travel in these navigation corridors, but also where tankers travel. So we saw earlier the way that this is the track that tankers take coming from the Alaskan oil fields. There are high densities of oil in those regions as well. But there are also high densities of persistent oil in some of these narrow waterways of the Inside Passage. So the Inside Passage is this navigable waterway that heads up the east coast of Vancouver Island, on up to Prince Rupert, and in fact you can carry on up to Alaska through these similar inland narrow sheltered waterways. But there are some quite high densities of persistent oil in these regions as well. So for the purposes of this highlights, let's look at one region in particular, Queen Charlotte Strait. This is just to the north of Vancouver Island. And let's zoom in on that region for a little bit to see what's happening there. So I thought it'd be interesting to show you on the left-hand side that for the same region, we released an analysis late last year assessing the sensitivity of coastal areas to oil spills. And so this is a plot of the relative sensitivity of different regions. And you can see that highlighted by the blue arrow. The Queen Charlotte Strait is a region that has relatively high or very high sensitivity to oil spills. So important to understand the relative density of oil in that region. So then on the right is the oil density map from this study zoomed into that region and highlighted by the blue area. So again, relatively high oil density where the ships are passing. Unfortunately for us, we have one of those passage lines, kind of a trip line, which will allow us to understand what exact ship traffic is passing through that region. And so you can see that on the graphs on this page here. On the left is the quantity of persistent oil passing by that passage line. So overall, in 1 year, on an average year, we'd have around 850,000 cubic meters of persistent oil passing that point in a year. So that's much less oil than, say, in the Salish Sea. So in the same units we used before, around 7 tanker loads worth, or if you turn that into Olympic swimming pools, around 332 Olympic swimming pools worth of persistent oil passing that particular point. But that's in the fuel tanks of a number of different ships. So let's look at the different ship types. The largest contributor is cruise ships. So that's the quantity of oil. They're bringing just over 600,000 cubic meters in an average year, and obviously not a COVID year, but in an average year in cruise season. You would see on the right here, you can see the number of ships. So 400 cruise ships bringing this quantity of persistent oil, followed by bulk carriers, and then other cargo ships. And now, interestingly, you'll note that tugs, there are many more tugs passing that same point in an average year, but they don't carry persistent oil because they are fueled with diesel oil, which is a non-persistent oil. Now, the report contains the same detailed analysis of persistent oil densities, and if you're interested to understand where non-persistent oil is in the region, I'd encourage you to take a look in the report. But let's follow along these cruise ships, which are an important contributor of bringing persistent oil to the different regions. And so we've created this animation of cruise ship traffic, which is very seasonal. So you can see it doesn't begin until May and June. You can see in high season, June, July, and August, lots of traffic. And then that cruise traffic subsides in October, and there's almost no traffic through the winter months before it begins to resume in April, May, and then back again into full swing in June. You can see on the bottom of the map the cruise ships calling on the US cruisers calling on Victoria on the way up to Alaska, and then when it returns again, you'll see the ships leaving Vancouver, heading up the Inside Passage here on their voyage up to Alaska. So I'll let you just watch that for a second. So the final important category of traffic I wanted to highlight for you from the report is our analysis of tugs, and in particular tugs and barges. So this is a very common phenomenon in off the Pacific coast. Tugs pulling barges that are loaded with goods. You might see them often wood chips piled high on barges, but they might carry building materials. They can carry containers, trucks, all manner of supplies for industry and communities up and down the coast. And they might also pull logs as raw materials for sawmills or pulp mills. But an extremely important component of the traffic in the region. And when you look at the traffic in terms of port calls, so we've created this graph. This is the number of times a type of vessel will call on a port measured in thousands. So, and these are in alphabetical order for the ports that we studied in the region. So the darker blue blocks are the large ocean-going vessels that we talked about in the up until now, and you can see them along the bottom. But the lighter turquoise blocks are the tugs, and you can see how important they are in terms of quantity. So in many ports, tugs will make up 10 times as much traffic in terms of individual vessel calls on a port than their ocean-going ship counterparts. And we've created a similar animation to the cruise ships of the tug traffic, also demonstrating some of the seasonality. So one thing to keep an eye out for here is the traffic off the west coast of Vancouver Island. So here, tugs are bringing supplies to communities and industries along the coast. Similarly, resupplying communities in Haida Gwaii, and that traffic tends to be more focused in the summer, when conditions are a little calmer. And then you can also see an interesting phenomenon happening here in this portion of the Inside Passage. There's two different routes you can take. One, a more sheltered route, more inland, and then this slightly more offshore, more exposed route. And the analysis shows that is more common in the summer, calmer months, and then it begins to decline in importance as we head into the rougher weather in the winter. So you can see this kind of traffic ebbing and flowing. Also important to look at the Salish Sea here in terms of how interconnected all the ports on Vancouver Island and the little industrial communities along the coast there. So hopefully this has given you some insight into the kind of fascinating insights you can gain by looking at this analysis. We think we've provided here a current and pretty comprehensive quantitative analysis of the commercial vessel traffic on Canada's Pacific coast. We think that it will be of interest to a number of groups, including hopefully you on the webinar, and that it really does dispel some of the misperceptions about commercial shipping in the region. But more importantly, I think hopefully that it will enable enhanced marine spatial planning. So with that, I'm going to ask the rest of the panel to join me so that we could begin taking a look at some of the Q&A. So Jim Hodgkinson joining me. Jim is part of our team and was one of the analysts that worked on the project. And Jennifer, you heard from earlier on, our manager of research and knowledge mobilization. Edward, I'm going to hand it over to you to hand us some questions from the Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to all of our panelists for a wonderful presentation. We've had quite a few questions coming in. We're going to start with just a question here, and possibly for Jen. Are you planning to expand this study to Canada's other coasts?
Yeah, we're hoping to. So we're hoping to look at the vessel traffic analysis plus the other components of the Marine Transportations Corridor project that we did in the Pacific region. So the emergency towing vessels, the sensitive coastal areas work. We're hoping to look at that on the Atlantic coast, St. Lawrence, and the Arctic coast as well. So stay tuned.
Great, thank you. Another question. The report says Clear Seas wants to address misconceptions around shipping. Could you just quickly just give us a headline view of that and how the report does that? I think perhaps Jim?
Yeah, certainly. So I mean, I think this is probably something that we can all answer, but I think one misconception that's, I guess, not exactly a misconception, but I think an easy mistake to make is that all big ships are the same to someone who's not necessarily familiar with them. For example, an unloaded container ship, a bulk carrier, and a tanker may all look fairly similar to the untrained eye. I think this report does a good job of describing not only the physical differences, but also the different patterns of behavior that these ships exhibit.
Yeah, I think I would add to that and say, Jim, that I think a lot of people think that ships are fairly unregulated and kind of go wherever they would like to and kind of have, but I think that the report helps to understand how carefully controlled and managed and optimized those traffic patterns are. And it's fascinating to understand just exactly what's causing them to take those carefully planned voyages that they do.
Thank you. Another question that's come in, this might be a little speculative, but have the various exclusion zones based on fuel caused ships to shift faster to liquefied natural gas, LNG? Paul, perhaps?
Sure. So I think the question is asking, has the imposition of the sulfur emissions control caused ship operators and owners to evaluate LNG? Absolutely. So one of the reasons for people looking at LNG, a couple of them are the fact that it's it's sometimes a cheaper fuel than the traditional fuels, but yes, it does have lower sulfur, so it is an opportunity to reduce sulfur, but not for all the traffic you would think about. So many of the high profile applications of LNG fuel in the region, for instance, BC ferries and C-span ferries who are using LNG fuel for their ferries, were using ultra low sulfur fuel in the first place. So in those examples, reducing sulfur emissions was not the driver to utilize LNG. But we are seeing some LNG fueled ships calling on the region. I think the first car carrier came into the region the other day. The vehicle carrier came. There was an LNG fueled vehicle carrier which was burning LNG as opposed to heavy fuel oil.
Great, thank you very much. Another question. This is interesting as we are doing a blog upcoming on anchorages, but does the traffic analysis include bulk cargo ships making multiple visits to the same port, i.e. consider the role of anchorages outside of port? If yes, I'd be interested in their emissions impact.
Maybe Jim, you can answer how we handled the fact that ships were making multiple visits to different berths in the port on one visit to the region, how that was accounted for. That would be helpful, I think, for people to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So the port calls figure that Paul showed earlier in the presentation used a passage line across the opening of the port to calculate the number of port calls. So for vessels like bulk carriers that transit back and forth from anchorage to berth and back again, that does get counted with some manual filtering to avoid overcounting.
Right. So I think the example was in that example, multiple passage lines crossings are counted as a single port call. So we do have the data. I think for the questioner, we do have the data to understand how many times a ship will go to an anchorage and back into the port. But in terms of accounting for port calls, we've done it on a basis of visits to the port, even if they make multiple stops at different berths.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Another question that's just come in. And just a reminder, if you haven't submitted a question, please do so. Just go into the app on the lower right side of your screen. We do have some time for some more questions. Here's another question. I am interested in the future of vessel traffic in specific in the Douglas Channel to Kitimat with the LNG, as well as Burrard Inlet to the tanks at Westridge Marine Terminal, how much of an increase should we expect in these two areas in the next few years? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are planning an analysis to understand, as the questioner asks, what the impact of the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion would be, and what the the Westridge terminal that they spoke about. So that's going to be forthcoming in the next month or so on that analysis. I think it would be it's an interesting question and something we could evaluate doing something similar on the LNG Canada, and understanding what the impact of the shipping traffic would look like on the region around Kitimat.
Thank you, Paul. Another question, I think following up on what you were talking about a little bit earlier. This comes, have you looked at the potential effects in oil density closest to coastal areas by the potential transition to LNG as a marine fuel?
So maybe I'll try and answer that. So I think the question is, have we looked at the oil density in coastal regions? Yes. So I think, and I think the question was asking about LNG. So just as an aside, ClearSea's role is not to advocate for one particular fuel or another. So we're intending to put out the facts on what is happening at the moment. So, for instance, you're absolutely right that this information we're providing on oil density should be helpful to people who are trying to make the case for switching from one fuel to another. So you saw as an example in my presentation these oil density plots. I'm sure that people will use that to understand the current situation and do some analysis to motivate for the potential of switching fuels. So I think that answers the question. Do the other panelists want to add anything there?
Yeah, I guess you could also add that if you're concerned particularly about different coastal areas, one thing we haven't done yet is to look at the overlay of the vessel traffic analysis with our sensitive coastal areas work, and that's an additional piece of analysis we could do to have an understanding of where traffic patterns are densest and where oil density is greatest relative to where the sensitivity is assessed higher on the coast. So that's another piece of add-on work we could do to follow up from the study, if that's an interesting question to people on the webinar and to our stakeholders.
Thank you for that. Another question, just a simple one, I believe. Oil density figures, are these annual figures correct?
I think I can maybe speak to that. Yes, the persistent and non-persistent oil density figures are showing data from 2016. So it's the whole year of data, oil density for all ships.
Great, thank you very much, Jim. Another comment, not so much a question, a nice compliment though, and we like to get compliments, but I have learned a lot already. My compliments to your team for evidence-based research, BZ. Another question here. Now, Victoria is not included. Does this mean that cruise maps do not include vessel traffic transiting Ogden Point?
I think I can maybe speak to that.
Yeah, thank you, Jim.
Yeah, so Victoria certainly was in the study area, and we did capture cruise traffic coming from Victoria. We didn't calculate port calls for Victoria, I believe. So we do have vessel traffic density, we do have all the track lines, so we have a good picture of the traffic, but we didn't quantify how many cruise ships were calling at Victoria. So.
Thanks very much. Another question, were you able to distinguish tug traffic by cargo, particularly oil cargo?
Do you want to start, Jim, or do you want, shall I?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that.
You start.
So, as you may know, tugs don't transmit, or rather barges don't transmit their cargo over AIS. So Nuka Research did some fairly intensive additional research to estimate the amounts of oil associated with each tug and barge track. So for each voyage, they did interviews and source data from a lot of different places, actually, to try to get a good sense of along each leg of the journey how much oil was being carried by that one tug, and the barges that it was towing. Cool.
Yeah. And I'm just looking down the questions. There's a couple of questions about ATBs, or articulated tug barges. For the purpose of the presentation, I simplified and just used the word tugs and barges, but ATBs were absolutely included in the analysis. And if you have a look, because as some of the questioners point out, ATB is a common way of moving petroleum products around the region. So a lot of the oil density in the region, particularly the non-persistent oil, and a little bit of bunker fuel that's moved in the region between refineries in Washington and the bunker terminals so bunkering is when you refuel a ship. So the ship fuel is brought to Vancouver in a barge from the refineries. So all of that traffic was included in the analysis. So when you look at those oil densities, we are including those ATBs, or articulated tug barges.
Good. Okay, I have another question. I think we have time for a couple more questions, and then we'll let everyone get on with their days. But how has the volume of persistent oil changed with the global sulfur cap from January 2020? And the comment says, I assume quantities of persistent oil have declined substantially and will continue to.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's maybe one of those misperceptions, I suppose, is that very low sulfur fuel oil, so reduced sulfur in fuels, doesn't necessarily change it from persistent to non-persistent. So the fuel oils that ships are burning today in compliance with IMO 2020 is still a kind of heavy fuel oil. So it is still considered a persistent oil when spilled. So that doesn't necessarily change its pollution risk, and so that's important factor to consider when you're thinking about different kinds of oil. Now, and maybe to add to that, yeah, it's because it's somewhat confusing, because there are examples of low sulfur, so fuel, which are non-persistent oil. So for instance, I mentioned earlier on ferries in the region, or commercial fishing vessels that are burning low sulfur non-persistent fuels, but most ocean-going cargo ships are going to be burning some kind of low sulfur fuel oil, which is nevertheless still a persistent oil.
Okay, and just finishing off, there's a number more questions. We will get back to you individually. Just a final question, interesting one. What was the source for cargo data for the study? Was it based on maximum capacity?
Well, maybe we can answer that. So I'm guessing the question is questioning about oil cargo, and maybe Jim, you can answer that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll unfortunately I can't ask for clarification, so I'll kind of answer it in two different directions at once. So if you're asking about cargo data for, say, cargo vessels, so how much kind of gross tonnage or how much cargo they were carrying, we didn't actually measure that. We do have statistics about the ship's capacities, for sure. Speaking about oil cargo, oil carried as cargo in either ATBs, tank barges, or tankers, we made estimates based on where the ship was transiting. So the methodology is outlined in the report as well, if you have any more questions. But it's based on the maximum capacity of fraction, kind of a representative fraction of that, so that we could measure the average amount being carried by those ships in the region.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. And I think that's it for the number of questions. I'd like to, on behalf of Clear Seas, like to thank our panelists, a wonderful presentation, and also thank you to the people who've signed up and participated today. We did just send out a link to you through the Q&A to the research report. Encourage you to go to our website and visit it and look at it in detail. If you have more questions and comments, please send them to us. We love feedback and we like to get additional questions. We have a survey attached to the seminar and also to our site itself. Now, we will be receiving a recorded copy of this morning's seminar, and that should be emailed to you within the next hour or so. Again, watch for new titles and research as Clear Seas makes it available. We have a new report coming out midsummer on incidents and accidents, and a new blog coming out in the next few days on the subject of anchorages. Please stay in touch with us, sign up with our newsletter. We're very good. We send it out quarterly. We will not inundate you with emails. You just will get our quarterly newsletter and the occasional breaking bits of information. Again, thank you very much. We hope you found this enjoyable, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you.